Welcome, friends of Bloor Central. This is Sunday Word for January 16th, 2022. Deeply regret that we still cannot gather together, but we hope that this Bible teaching will be a blessing to you. Couple quick updates. They're not really updates. We're just kind of plugging along, letting you know that we are still gathering at Bloor Central on Sunday mornings at 10 a.m. for Sunday Word. We are providing the Bible teaching with this video online each week, but we continue to meet socially distanced, sanitizing our hands, masks, all that kind of stuff. We're still doing that Sunday morning. We're also going ahead with our community meal as a takeaway on Saturday nights, and we're still doing the food bank Wednesdays and Thursdays. You will know that COVID is becoming more and more of an issue. This new variant is spreading very, very quickly. If something were to happen where we were unable to gather or we had to close our services, we would be putting it up on our website. We would be sending it out on our newsletter, the Bloor Central link. If you're not signed up for the Bloor Central link, then I'd encourage you to get online, go to our bloorcentral.com website, check out the link there, and you will find a place to sign up for the link so that when it goes out, you will be informed as quickly as possible. However, we're so grateful so far. We've not been hit with any sort of direct COVID sort of cases, so we're moving right along. I'm very excited to let you know that our 24/7 prayer room is up and running. Well, it's functional. Let's put it that way. We've got it already. I'm so grateful for all the work that's gone into that. However, you'll know with COVID, we can't invite you up there right now. So it's a little bit of disappointment from that standpoint. But what we do want to tell you is that everything is up and running. We've got a few last minute touches. We'll actually probably share some pictures with you next week just so you can see what's happening. The 24/7 prayer, I want to make it clear, this isn't when we used to run the 24/7 prayer weeks in our chapel. That would be where people would be there for 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Someone was praying. This 24/7 prayer room is a room, this is available. It's available for anyone that wants to find a place, a quiet place in the city to come and pray. We've got a number of different partners, different organizations, 24/7 Canada, Toronto House of Prayer. We've got other churches in the area that are going to partner with us on this. And we're hoping that this will really turn into a city resource, praying for the city in the city. And so that's really the aim of this. It is a tangible expression of our desire at Bloor Central to seek God. We want to make it possible for people who are looking to seek God that they'll be able to come and make use of our 24/7 prayer room. We are going to have some stuff going up on the website about that. We'll have some guidelines, some instructions on how you can sign up and how you can get access to the room outside of normal hours. A lot of things to still work out. Obviously, we're going to have to wait for COVID before it's fully open, but just to let you know that we're plugging along with that, and we're looking forward to that being an important part, really part of our culture here at Bloor Central. Will be very much centered around the 24/7 prayer room. So I want to get started on the Bible lesson this morning. The Bible is full of all kinds of different sorts of writing. There's some that is historical. There's some that's poetic. There's some that is actually just kind of theological or where they're dealing with a topic perhaps. Acts is a book in the Bible which is historical. It speaks about the beginning of the church. Paul was a guy that was very involved with that. And Paul was a guy who early on in the church was talking a lot about Jesus as the Messiah. And there were a lot of religious leaders at the time that were extremely unhappy about it. They did not like what Paul had to say. They were trying to get him killed. They were trying to get him arrested. Eventually he was arrested by the Romans who were in charge. He was arrested in Jerusalem, but the the Roman emperor had moved in there and taken control. So it was actually the Romans that had him arrested. And to be honest, the Romans didn't know what to do with him. And eventually what happened was it was decided that they'd send him off to Rome. They'd send him to the emperor, and Caesar would be the one that would figure out what to happen with Paul. So in Acts 27, which I want to read to you, a passage from there right now, it talks about this trip, this journey from Jerusalem to Rome. And listen, this was a nightmare. This was a terrible trip. It's like the planes, trains, and automobiles version in the ancient world. That's basically what was happening here. We read in chapter 27 that, again, Paul went off there was a group of prisoners. all under the guard. There was a guard named Julius who was in charge of these guys, in charge of taking care of them on the trip. And what happened was they were traveling through October into November, which is not a good time to be traveling in that part of the world. The winds are not favorable, but they're better than going in December or January. Apparently it was well known you don't travel in the winter at all because the winds, the seas were just too rough. But it talks a little bit about this in Acts chapter 27. I'm going to begin reading at verse 8, but in verse 1 through 8, it starts talking about how difficult the journey was. They were slow. They were getting behind time. They were getting anxious. Julius, the guard, was getting anxious because, he wanted to get to Rome as soon as possible. I'm going to pick this up in verse 8 and read through to verse 25. If you've got your Bibles there, follow along with me. I think Jared will put the reading up on the screen as well. So it says this in Acts 27, verse 8. We moved along the coast with difficulty and came to a place called Fair Havens near the town of Lasea. Much time had been lost, and sailing had become dangerous because by now it was after the Day of Atonement. So Paul warned them, men, I can see that our voyage is going to be disastrous and bring great loss to ship and cargo and to our own lives. But the centurion, instead of listening to Paul, said, followed by the advice of the pilot and the owner of the ship, since the harbor was unsuitable to winter in, the majority decided that we should sail on, hoping to reach Phoenix and winter there. This was a harbor in Crete, facing both southwest and northwest. When a gentle south wind began to blow, they saw their opportunity, so they weighed anchor and sailed along the shore of Crete. Before very long, a wind of hurricane force called a northeaster swept down from the island. The ship was caught by the storm and could not head into the wind. So we gave way to it and were driven along. As we passed to the lee of a small island called Cauda, we were hardly able to make the lifeboat secure. So the men hoisted it aboard. Then they passed ropes under the ship itself to hold it together because they were afraid they would run aground on the sandbars of Sithis. They lowered the sea anchor, but let the ship be driven along. We took such a violent battering from the storm that the next day they began to throw cargo overboard. On the third day, they threw the ship's tackle overboard with their own hands. When neither sun nor stars appeared for many days, and the storm continued raging, we finally gave up all hope of being saved. After they'd gone a long time without food, Paul stood up before them and said, men, you should have taken my advice not to sail from Crete. Then you would have spared yourselves this damage and loss. But now I urge you to keep up your courage, because not one of you will be lost. Only the ship will be destroyed. Last night, an angel of God to whom I belong and whom I serve stood beside me and said, do not be afraid, Paul. You must stand trial before Caesar. And God has graciously given you the lives of all who sail with you. So keep up your courage, men, for I have faith in God that it'll happen just as he told me. Now, there's a lot of interesting things that happen in this passage in Acts chapter 27. But for my purposes today, I want to talk about a very short, just 2 words. And it's a message. It's a lesson, probably the shortest lesson I've ever given since I've been at Bloor Central. But in order to understand the lesson, you have to understand the context. So most of my time is going to be spent on talking about the context, even though the lesson is so very, very short, really summed up in 2 words. But we have to understand all the stuff, because there's a lot of things going on around here that help us to explain why this lesson is so powerful and why it's so appropriate for our day, for the season that we're going through right now. The first thing I think we should note is that, Paul did nothing wrong. You know, Paul had just been speaking about Jesus. He'd been speaking right from the Bible, and yet what he was saying was not, there were many people that hated him. And so they were really trying to make life difficult for him. They were trying to kill him. He'd been beaten. Now he got arrested. He spent time in prison. Now he's on this terrible journey, stuck in the middle of the storm. I mean, this is something that could easily be overlooked. But to recognize that, you know, we get in storms sometimes when really it doesn't feel like we've done anything wrong. It can feel drastically unfair. I mean, if anyone had a right to say this was unfair, it was Paul. And that's the way storms are sometimes. We get so carried away with the fact that, oh, this is just unfair. I didn't do anything wrong. You know, but to recognize that, hey, sometimes life just isn't fair. And this trip itself was just turning into an absolute, you know, nightmare for everyone. You know, they're falling behind schedule, and that's creating some stress as well. They're traveling at a bad time of year, and Paul warns them and says, listen, let's stop here in Fairhaven. This is not a good time for us to be going. Paul had already been through some shipwrecks. He had experience at the sea. He knew that this was really a formula for disaster. It looked like they were heading into trouble. But Julius listened to the owner and to the captain. It says, you know, the majority wanted to keep going. Paul was the one that was speaking reason. But it was on the advice of the owner and the captain that they continued. They set off. Part of the problem, too, was the conditions seemed so good. It was like a good wind that came up that, oh, well, you know, the wind looks good. Let's take off. Let's make for it. You know, there are so many ways in which we find ourselves in storms by making bad decisions. You know, I don't want to get bogged down in this because I want to get on to the lesson, but I think it is, you know, really important to recognize that there are some things here that really brought them into this storm that were their own fault. Not the fault of Paul, but certainly for Julius and for the captain and for the owner for the ship. And they put those 276 lives at danger. There was 276 people on the boat. And all these guys are in danger because, well, they were in a rush, you know. So many times we make bad decisions. We end up sailing into storms because we're in too much of a rush to pay attention to what's going on. The second thing was that, you know, the experts, you know, the captain and the owner, they're the experts, and they were the ones saying, oh yeah, no, it's fine, completely ignoring the well-known wisdom that they're traveling at a very difficult time of year, and recognizing that their progress has been extremely slow. The last thing that really created this situation where they ended up in the storm was suddenly a good wind shows up. And again, you know, when you look around and say, oh, everything looks fine, we start to ignore really important wisdom. Everyone knew it was a bad time of year to be traveling. And Paul spoke very loudly. But, oh, look, everything seems fine. And they just ignored what the wisdom of that time of year not to be traveling. And they end up in this terrible storm. You know, I want to look inside this storm. It's important for me that you would really use your imagination to understand all the things that are happening here. In verse 14 and 15, it says, before very long, a wind of hurricane force swept down from the island. The ship was caught by the storm. These are really important words, and you've got to be able to really get your mind around what was happening. Everything was fine when they left. But suddenly a storm came in. The weather changes quickly, and we can find that in our lives when we do make a decision too quickly, when we allow ourselves to listen to the experts and really, you know, people who think they know what they're talking about rather than pay attention to wisdom, or when we just kind of look around and say, oh yeah, I don't see any wrong. When we ignore the wisdom of those around us, and we can end up in a storm. And this one came on quick. They never saw it coming. But in verse, it says it came on, they were caught. The ship was caught in the storm. It actually says that in verse 14 or 15. The ship was caught by the storm. Get an understanding of that, because normally, you see, in a storm, a captain would be able to steer the ship. And this is saying that eventually it was useless. They just let the ship be driven along by the storm. It says in verse 15, the ship was driven along by the storm. So no longer were they controlling where they were going. They couldn't do that anymore. That's what happens in a storm. You lose control of where you're actually going. You know, maybe sometimes your life feels like it's out of control. Maybe that's because you're finding yourself in a storm. You've allowed yourself to somehow get caught into a storm where literally you have no control. And that's what was happening here. The ship was caught in the storm. The storm was in control. Suddenly the captain could not steer the ship where he wanted to go. You know, every line that is written in these verses about what happened around the ship are really important and powerful. It says that the lifeboat that they carried at the back, normally they would be, you know, just dragging that behind them. That's what they did in the ancient days. But they're saying now it's so rough, they were afraid that somehow the lifeboat was going to come crashing down on the ship and cause damage. So they had to pull it in and tie it down. Not only did they tie the lifeboat down, but it says they took ropes and they wrapped them around the undersides of the ship so that they could tie them off to hold the ship together. The seas were so rough, they didn't know where they were going. They thought they might run aground and that the ship would start to break up. So that they literally decide, we've got to try and keep ourselves together here. So they wrap these ropes around. That's how desperate it's getting now. They can't steer. The lifeboat now, you know, is out of control. They can't even control that. And now they're wrapping ropes around to try and keep the ship together. You know, everything that you're beginning to hear here, can you understand the panic that is going on? Can you understand, you know, how desperate they were? It says that, you know, and this can be a little bit confusing. There's a little bit of, when I was researching this, it says that they let down the sea anchor. Now, there's a little bit of controversy here because some people think the sea anchor is referring to the anchor, you know, an anchor that we would let down to hold, to grab onto something at the bottom of the sea so that the ship doesn't drift aimlessly. So some people think that's what it's talking about. Other people say the sea anchor was actually a term that described the sails. The sails were sometimes referred to as the sea anchor. It doesn't matter whether it was an anchor that was going down to the bottom or it was sails. The message here is that whatever they were relying on before was useless. The anchor didn't work. The sails don't work. They literally, all these things that they depended on, all these things that they were used to relying on in a storm were absolutely useless because the storm had caught the ship. I'm wanting you to get a picture of the next thing that's important to note. It says, for days, they couldn't see the sun. They couldn't see the stars. Well, in the ancient world, that's the way they found their way around. That was the way that they knew where they could calculate from the stars where they were, and then they knew where to go. But now, they didn't know where they were. They couldn't see anything. They didn't have a radar system or anything like that. So literally, all these things that they learned to rely on were completely useless. They were in the middle of a storm, and they were completely at the mercy of the storm. It's a desperation. It's a panic. They've lost control of the ship. They don't know where they are. Even if they knew where they are, they don't know the direction they're going. They don't know which direction they need to go, even if they could steer, but they can't. It is a complete feeling of helplessness in the middle of this. It's panic. It's desperation. And if you can imagine these 276 people, they've given up hope that they were ever going to be saved. It ends up, they're even throwing the cargo overboard. They're taking the cargo, they're taking the tackle and stuff from the ship, thinking that it's, you know, that the extra weight is going to drag them down. So they're taking these steps of absolute desperation to throw this stuff overboard. And they're hoping that these ropes that they've tied around are going to hold them together. You know, it comes to the point where they stop eating. This is a real picture of absolute desperation. Can you picture this? Now perhaps you can't picture this actual event, but I think you can picture what a storm is like. And I think you can identify something with what is going on, particularly in our time now. We are not in the middle of the sea in a storm, but we are in the middle of the most global pandemic in history. You know, this could be considered a storm, and we're all caught in it. Many of the things that we have depended on are just not functioning anymore. Much of the way in which we carried on our lives have been completely disrupted by this storm. There's a real sense in which our future is not in our hands. You know, we're waiting to be saved out in the middle of a raging sea. You know, we don't know what's going to be happening. There are businesses that have been closed, and they're waiting to find out whether they're going to be able to reopen. Students are waiting to find out whether they can get to school. When they get to school, they're waiting to find out whether they're going to get sent home again. You know, the healthcare system is pushed to its limit. We understand now that for many people that need normal sort of medical procedures, it's just not available. They can't do it right now because of the COVID. Travel plans are being disrupted. Flights are being canceled left, right, and center. You don't know if you're going to be able to get to your destination, and once you get there, you don't know if you're going to be able to get back. I was reading this week about a guy who was on the phone with his bank trying to make a simple transfer that normally he does quite routinely for 5 minutes. He was on the phone for more than 2 hours. When he complained, they said, "Sir, I'm really sorry. We're just so short-staffed because of COVID." You know, normally we depend on the banks, we depend on the airlines, you know, we depend on the schools and our businesses. We depend on our healthcare system. But these things are letting us down now. We're in the middle of a storm. These things that we would normally depend on, we're finding out they're not as secure as we'd hoped. You know, the other thing I wanted to mention too is like we're hearing now about the supply chains. Truckers now, some aren't going to be able to come over the border because of the vaccination policies. And so now we're finding that people are saying, yeah, we're not sure how long, you know, the things are going to be supplied, how long the shelves are going to be filled for. This week at the church, our furnace broke down, our heating unit, and there's a part that they can't get into the country because of COVID. And so we're pretty cold this week. Over and over again, these things that we learn to depend on are letting us down because we're in the middle of a storm. And in the middle of a storm, things don't work normally. Even at the church, you know, we're not allowed to invite people in to share a meal with us, which we would normally do on a Saturday night. We just have to give them a bag and give it to them at the door. Our worship is socially distanced, and it's completely different from what we are used to. The food bank, again, we have to do it curbside. We're having to throw out the things that we normally do and just do what we can because we're in the middle of a storm. And in the middle of a storm, things that you learn to depend on, you know, you realize you can't do those anymore. And in this case, it says that they had given up hope. A couple of weeks ago, I was talking to a guy, and he said to me, you know, hey, let's just hang on. Let's just hang on and get through this. And when he said it, it reminded me of these guys on the boat who put the ropes around it. It's like they're trying to keep things together. I feel like for many of us, that's what COVID's like. We're just hanging on. Let's hang on and let's get through it. We're just trying to not fall apart. So that's the context. That's the context of the lesson that I want to share with you today. You know, it's in the middle of this desperation and panic that Paul shares some words. He has something really encouraging. You know, they'd made a big mistake and they're going to lose a lot of stuff, Paul says, but hey, no one's going to die. Now that's good news. That's an encouraging message that Paul offers to all these guys that are on the ship. You know, when you're in the middle of the storm and you think you're going to lose you don't know what's happening, you've lost control of everything, just to get a message like that, say, hey, I'm not going to die. You know, that is a huge encouragement. So that's great, but that message of encouragement, that's not even the lesson that I want to share with you today. There's a lot of stuff that I could share with you, but in the middle of this desperation and panic, just before Paul, as Paul is giving these words, I want our focus to be on verse 23, because in verse 23, at the very beginning, it says, Paul says, an angel of God was with him. And the angel said, Do not be afraid, Paul. So there in verse 23, where the angel said, let me just check that. I want to make sure I've got the right verse here. I'm just looking at my notes, and I'm not sure that I put that down right. But this very casual statement that is made at the beginning. I'm sorry. It is the first verse of verse 24. Boy, I'm having trouble finding my stuff here. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Sorry. Okay. The first two words of verse 24. That's a lesson for the day. As Paul is speaking to the angel, he writes, and said. This angel that had come from God said something to Paul. In the middle of the storm, God speaks to Paul. You know, literally, the message that I want to share with you today is found in those two words, and said. Many times when we get in the storm, we're overcome with fear, worry, trying to figure out what to do. And I want, you know, in the middle of the storm that we face, I want to make really clear, God speaks in the storm. You know, and that has to make a difference. All these guys that were panicking and were, you know, terrified, Paul could speak words of encouragement to them. How desperately, I believe, our world needs the church now. The church to recognize that God is still speaking in this storm. And there's a lot of uncertainty about it, but I know God speaks. And it's in the middle of all this panic and desperation that we as a church need to be standing up and saying, hey, have courage, everyone. Have courage. God is still speaking. God speaks to us through his word. God speaks to us, you know, through prayer. We've had so many different ways. As we enter into Thanksgiving, we believe that God begins to speak to our hearts about the things that we can be thankful for. You know, this year, more than any other, I think this message applies to us to recognize in the middle of this storm that those things that we can normally depend on, we can't depend on them. But that doesn't mean that we've been left alone. And it's been proven back in Acts chapter 27 that God speaks right in the middle of a storm. When everyone else has given up, we don't. We don't. Our focus in 2022 for Bloor Central is that we would be seeking God. And I really believe the world needs for us, our community needs for us to be seeking God. Because as they are in desperation and panic, we need to be the people that are standing up and saying, no, God's speaking to us. It's not over. Have courage. We can be the people. As Paul stands up there, he was the one that could give them courage, could give them direction, could tell them exactly what to do. Everyone else was panicking and giving up, but not Paul. And the reason Paul didn't give up is because God speaks in the storm. You know, I want to encourage you, you know, to be really keeping your focus on seeking God this year. I know he's speaking. He's been speaking to us in so many different ways through COVID. It's not that I would ever want COVID to happen again. And there's been many unhappy things that have happened through COVID. But I want to say God has been speaking. And it's been exciting in many ways to see the different ways that God has been speaking to us through the COVID. He speaks in the storm. That's the tremendous power of this lesson from Acts chapter 27. So as you're seeking him, I encourage you to be paying attention. You know, what ways has God spoken to you in the past? Do you think that God is speaking to you through COVID? What can help you to hear from him? What is it? We're hoping our prayer room and we're hoping that the way that we're designing our worship is all focused on us hearing and seeking God. We can do all kinds of other things, but if we're not seeking God, then all the other stuff just turns into bells and whistles. We want this to be a place where it's quite clear we are seeking God. I want to close with a prayer for all of us. I'm hoping that we pray this together, and I'm going to ask Jared, he'll put the words of Psalm 139, verses 23 and 24. We were looking a little bit at this passage in the Bible study on Wednesday nights, our Zoom Bible study. And this is a prayer that I would really encourage us to be praying to God as we're seeking him. Because as we pray this, I believe if we can create a still place, if we can pray this with a real spirit of stillness, like not just rushing it, but to really take time, we can actually begin to hear God responding, guiding our hearts. And I just want to end with this prayer. This is for me, but I'm encouraging you to pray it for yourself as well. Lord, we pray. Search me, God, and know my heart. Test me and know my anxious thoughts. See if there is any offensive way in me, and lead me in the way everlasting. Lead us in the way everlasting. Amen.